All right, so I like Carol's suggestion. Let's take a minute and bring ourselves present into the room. I could use that myself. So if you join me, find a position you feel comfortable in. Your feet flat on the ground or up on your chair, if that works better for you. Holding your back straight but not tight. As you breathe in intentionally, let your breath show you how to hold yourself. If you can, breathing in through the nose, and then breathing out through your mouth. Thank you. All right, so I want to pick up this week on where we left off last week. So I want to just recap a little bit of what was going on in the end of chapter 3 that we glossed over, and then use that to launch into the reflections of chapter 4 and some of the comments, the critical and constructive engagement with Taylor's work that we get from Melissa Orley. So I'm not going to walk you through every point that Taylor has made, but I will try to recap some of the key bits. This is the last week where we are building in the key concepts that we will then use to think about 2,500 years of Western philosophy in the coming weeks. So this is using the utility belt example. This is the last week where we're fashioning tools that we're going to put into our utility belt, which we will then be using for the remainder of the course. So where we left off last week is I walked you through sections 3.1 and sections 3.2, but I didn't really talk about section 3.3. And I'd like to pick up a few key points from that, because they're essential to what Taylor then does in chapter 4. So in 3.3, he's talking about the status of the moral. He's established, he thinks, right? He's argued that moral thinking requires qualitative discrimination, and that these discriminations provide moral intuitions. Okay? So that's what he'd been arguing to that point, that to think morally, we have to be capable of having these strongly ordered goods, making qualitative discriminations. And he sort of goes to some effort to point out that these reasons, these moral reasons that allow us to make these discriminations, are neither external considerations, that is, they're not the sort of thing that you could necessarily have access to without also being able to see the moral point. And they're not basic reasons, right? So an external consideration is, this is the logic of ordinary middle-sized dry goods, right? It's the kind of thing where you don't have to be particularly into bread to be able to recognize that there's a bread box there. Or you don't have to be particularly into science fiction to be able to recognize that that's a novel and that's shelves here or wherever. But when we're talking about these qualitative discriminations, we're talking about something else. The moral reasons involve the participant, involve the evaluator, although that's an iffy term here, involve the person in seeing them. You become a different sort of person if you see them. And you can be prevented from seeing them by being one way or another, right? I had, do I tell you this or not? I mean, I don't want to, I guess that you're already far enough into the course that you're past ad drop. So I had, when I was in, when I was doing, yeah, when I was doing, first studying philosophy, and my brother was studying philosophy as well, and we were trying to make sense of the different schools that were out there. And I remember staying up really late one night and coming to the conclusion that a certain kind of approach to studying analytic philosophy could make you a worse person. Now, it doesn't necessarily, but it was a risk. There was like a higher number of people who were kind of, you didn't want to hang out with them, who were studying analytic philosophy, and it seemed to have a detrimental effect. Like, they were cool to begin with, and then the more they did it, the more they kind of got aggressive, and so there was a kind of thought process that prevented seeing a certain sort of good, right? The good of, say, not pressing your case even when you could, right? The good of letting a shabby argument go by for the sake of hanging out with each other. It's the good of conviviality over the good of logical exactitude, right? That's not guaranteed. There's a lot of really great analytic philosophers who are really great people. But there's a risk there. And that risk has to do with a certain sort, it has to do with becoming a certain way in order to perform a certain task. And I don't think we think about this quite enough in our world. There's so many things you can do in the world, but the thing, in order to acquire skills, you often have to, as a sort of bargaining chip for acquiring those skills, for acquiring those perceptual capacities, you have to give up something. And some of what we give up isn't just time, isn't just energy, isn't just other life choices. Some of what we give up is being a certain way. So certain skills, certain capacities seem to require certain modes of life to actualize them. Or let's put it this way, if they don't require it, they maybe attract it. There's a sort of attraction to certain modes of life. And that's one of the things that we need to learn to weigh. So in our culture, though, we oftentimes miss that, in part because we don't think a lot about the kind of person it's good to be, nearly as much as people did in the ancient world. So Taylor says these moral reasons are not rooted in external considerations. They're things that you can't just point to something outside in order to be able to understand them. Neither are they rooted in basic reasons. And a basic reason has a certain logical form. A basic reason has the logical form of do A because A is B. And I know that obligation attaches to B, right? So a basic reason is to say, I know there's something you should do, and I can, and this is a sort of, not a trick, but this is a tool of analysis that's often used in a lot of contemporary philosophy, is you try to show that you're under a moral obligation to do something because you show that that thing really, properly understood, is a species of this other moral obligation that there's no controversy about, right? There's no controversy about I shouldn't murder the innocent. And so then if I can show you that, say, a certain type of warfare does involve something that I could say that is murdering the innocent, then I've shown you that I'm under obligation not to engage in that kind of activity, right? But that's not what Taylor's saying these moral reasons are either. Those are uncontroversial arguments. Everybody accepts them. Taylor's making a much more controversial argument that there are certain things that you can only recognize if you yourself are changed in order to come to recognize them. And if you become a different sort of person. So how then do we have an argument about that, right? How do we get anywhere? Do we just sit at cross purposes with one another? Do I assert how I feel about my things? This is how I see it, and you tell me how you see it, and then we just are like, well, that's it. Good. Glad we got to that point. We now recognize that we can have no further conversation. And there is actually a lot of scholarly and philosophical argument that looks like that. I've been to so many academic conferences where at the end of a really successful paper or really successful panel, at the end of it, the people on the panel come to recognize that they've found their way to competing basic intuitions, as they say, right? So there's an irreconcilable difference, but at least we've gotten clear on where our differences are. We've come to competing basic intuitions. Now, the way I think about this, and I think the way Taylor thinks about this, is there's something tragic about that, because that's the cessation of conversation, and which is the cessation of relationship, right? Aristotle thought that friendship, the fundamental medium of friendship, was the capacity to converse with your friends. Once conversation stops, the possibility of building friendship stops. If we just have competing basic intuitions, especially over things with which our identities are bound up, that is, over moral issues, then we're in a pretty tragic spot. Taylor, though, thinks you can get some purchase on these moral reasons, not by leveraging an argument that uses external considerations or basic reasons. So not in something that can necessarily win everyone over. It won't have the structure of an argument that I necessarily win, where I can say QED, it's proven, but instead through something that has that's a little bit like a pointing out exercise. So what I can do through the process of articulation, or what you can do through the process of conversation, is we can begin to say, well, you see it this way and I see it that way. Let's try to describe it in finer detail. And by describing it in finer detail, by pointing out what's going on there, why do I feel that way? What's the story I tell myself about this? By articulating it, I'm beginning to invite you to come alongside me, or you're inviting me to come alongside you, and to see what it's like to see that, right? And that capacity to begin to feel your way into what it's like, which is also a form of thinking, that can begin to disclose these moral reasons, these qualitative discriminations. Those of you who are involved in any kind of spiritual practice or have trained with a spiritual teacher, this probably makes immediate sense to you, right? This is the structure of a lot of spiritual practice, a lot of meditative practice or something like that. You don't know what it is. When they first start telling you about what interior silence is or something, you're like, well, I don't know. I know how to be quiet. I know what it's like to fall asleep. But you don't know what that is, and instead you're sort of guided along the way. And having someone who knows what that's like, who can, in a certain sense, use an intelligence that's capable of understanding whether you are actually seeing that or not, they can help guide you. That's what Taylor is describing. But he's describing that in a moral frame rather than in the sort of spiritual frame that maybe some of you are familiar with it. Taylor says this is actually a pretty normal way for us to engage with people. This is a pretty common sense way. When you're in families, this is how we teach our children oftentimes, right? Maybe we give them lists of right and wrong when they're not capable of understanding, but I try with my children to try to show them why that's wrong, right? Why is your brother crying right now? What happened? And why would that not be a good choice to make next time, right? But it's not a question of just saying, do this. It's a question of revealing a good that is otherwise missed. But under what Taylor calls the bewitchment of modern moral philosophy, we find it hard to even see that this is something we should be talking about. Here I think what he means by bewitchment is that there's a certain, it's a good language, because it's as if a spell has been cast over people trying to think about these ethical and moral issues today, so that they're not capable of seeing the salient factors. They're not capable of seeing the things that are bound up with human life already, things that are quite natural to us, and so we miss them. Wittgenstein used a similar example, except he didn't talk about bewitchment. Wittgenstein says in the Philosophical Investigations, it's a lovely point, very important point in it, where he says the whole Philosophical Investigations has this sort of conversational tone. It's like Wittgenstein carrying on a conversation within himself. It's also one of the few really funny philosophy books out there. There's a lot of jokes in it. And at one point, Wittgenstein says, "What's the aim of your philosophy?" Posing the question to himself. And his answer is, to show the fly the way out of the bottle. And what he means by that is that it's a kind of therapy. There's philosophy, our thinking, not necessarily what we do when we read a philosophy book, but the broader sort of rational constructs within which we've come to live our lives functions as a kind of bottle around us, preventing us from seeing certain things, preventing us from asking certain questions, and also often inducing us to believe certain things that we maybe wouldn't believe otherwise, right? Wittgenstein calls that language gone on a holiday. Language has this We craft language to make sense of things. Like we craft a moral language to make sense of the relationship of my daughter Layla to her brother, right? I craft a language. We use something that makes sense in terms of a sort of a process of formation whereby we're growing up into the good. But then we take that language on a holiday. We take it outside of interpersonal relationships and then start using it to talk about some other thing. We start using it to talk about metaethics, the grounds of why there is a good at all, or something like that. That's what he means by it's gone on a holiday. It's left the place in which it fit and went on vacation somewhere else. And when it goes on vacation somewhere else, it can lead us to believe all sorts of things that maybe are crazy. Right? Wittgenstein's he usually thinks about that in relationship to the self. He thinks the idea that there's a soul in me, like a kind of thing that a dementor could suck out or that you could take out and put in a bottle, right? As a sort of quasi-material aspect of me that's separate from my body, that weighs however much it's supposed to weigh, before and after I die, right? That the idea that there's some sort of quasi-material thing like that, he thinks that's completely our being caught by language to think about something, to reify something that actually describes much more a relational event. He's very happy to talk about soul, but soul exists when we look at each other in the eyes. Soul is a way of relating, it's a way of understanding, a way of comporting myself to other people. Soul isn't, on Wittgenstein's account, some sort of abstract noun, but because it's a noun in our language, we're enticed into thinking of it a certain way. That's the bottle. So Taylor's saying something similar. There's a bottle that modern moral philosophy has stuck us into, so we start thinking about, we get in these ruts of thinking about the good in a certain way and being utterly incapable of thinking about it in other ways. We can't even pose the questions that Taylor's trying to raise. The question, not just what is it good to do, but also what is it good to be. And, preview, for, as we'll see in chapter 4, also what is it good to love? What must be loved? Right, which is part of the reason why I thought I'd call in old Thierry of Chartres over there, the wonderful 12th century philosopher and mystic. Okay, so now the other distinction that gets brought in chapter 3 that's really important is a distinction between procedural and substantive ethics, which is tied to a distinction between procedural and substantive reason. Substantive reason means that we judge the rationality of something by whether they get it right? Whether our judgments track the real reasons that are in things. There's in Greek and Latin, it's a lot easier to think about it this way because the reason or the identity, the essence of a thing would get called the rationes, right? And reason is ratio. Or in Greek, it's oftentimes called the logoi. These are like the little words, the little definitions, the little essences of things. It's what a thing is. And so to be rational is to comport your mind, your nous, your understanding to the reasons that exist in things, the logoi that exist in things. And so a substantive view of reason is saying, it's did you get it right? It's not did you follow the right mechanism to draw conclusions in accord with a certain procedure, right? To follow a certain method. Instead, a substantive view of reason aims at truth. Gadamer wrote a famous book called Truth and Method. That's his point. Gadamer wants to say, in focusing on method, which is proper within the field of the natural sciences, the humanities have lost their focus on truth, which is the goal of hermeneutics, is the goal of understanding, right? But that doesn't just involve following the right method. We all know you can follow the right method and just have things go horribly wrong in life, in relationships, in cooking, right? So substantive ethics, a substantive view of the ethical is to say that we've got a right view of the ethic. I think we still talk this way about rationality a little bit, even though we tend to use reason to talk about following the right procedures, doing the right logic, be reasonable often means think it through, define your terms, right? Be clear about what's going on. But we also use it sometimes when we talk about like an irrational view of the world, right? Someone can have all sorts of reasons. You know, in 8th grade, I had a world studies teacher in like, it was an honors program, and our world studies teacher was a member of the Flat Earth Society. Literally, yeah. So it was like, and he had all sorts of reasons for this, right? He was a fine world studies teacher, right? Because he didn't talk about, like, that's not his domain, right? The sphericity or lack thereof of the Earth was not a question for understanding China, right? But he would, after class or on field trips when we're all on the bus together, he'd just start talking to us about how the Earth is flat, and he had tons of reasons for it, which, as an 8th grader, you know, were interesting. I didn't think, but even then, I didn't think like, oh, the Earth is flat, right? He seemed to follow a mode of thought. In fact, seemed to be really committed to a certain mode of thought. But you could look at that and say, like, no, that's irrational, dude. That's not a thing. The Earth isn't flat, right? And anyway, so that's what I'm trying to say is there's still a way in which we use this substantive view of rationality, not just tied to procedure, right? Colloquially, we can still do that. Say, quit being irrational. Look in front of you. Look, this is what's going on. You're gaslighting me, right? So we can still use it in a substantive way, but we've drawn away from using reason in that substantive way when we're in sort of the higher echelons of abstraction, of thought, or when we're trying to do ethics. And Taylor wants to say that there's something important about this substantive view of ethical. The suppression, he says, of substantive morality, the reduction, the bewitchment of modern moral philosophy, so that we only follow a certain procedure when thinking about these things. Because to follow the substantive way means we also ask, what is it good to be? Not just, what must I do? What are the rules that govern what I must do? We also ask, what's it good to be? Finally, what's the good, right? The bewitchment of modern moral philosophy leads us to be stuck in what Taylor calls the strange, cramped theories of modern moral philosophy. There's a line from Crime and Punishment where Dostoevsky says, low ceilings and tiny rooms cramp the soul and the mind. But low theoretical ceilings and tiny theoretical rooms do exactly the same thing. They cramp the soul and they cramp the mind, making it impossible for us to fully develop. And that's why this is such a morally important issue for Taylor, because the capacity to ask these questions, to articulate relations to substantive morality, allows us to see them more deeply, allows us to see the good more deeply. And so it allows us to be transformed by it. To be prevented from asking those questions is a kind of moral injury, right? It cramps the soul and stultifies the mind. All right, so we then get to chapter 4, and chapter 4 is called Moral Sources. If hypergoods are the sort of epitome of Taylor's whole sort of conceptual architecture, moral sources are its heart. Moral sources are what drive the moral life. So Taylor asks the question. What starts this chapter out, what he's trying to get to here is the concern, why should I seek articulation? Why not a kind of humble silence about these things that can be so difficult to get right? And he gives a number of good reasons for why you might want to be silent about it. He's not just going to, one of the things, playing off what Rick often says about carrying the pull of doubt for your reader, Taylor doesn't just say, why articulation? Well, here are 3 objections to articulation, and then ram his way through it, right? Instead, he's going to say, why should we seek articulation, and really try to understand, to articulate the views for why others would be reticent about this. To begin with, he says, one key reason, and you've heard me say this again and again, for why we should seek articulation is because in dealing with these deeper or higher goods, in dealing with these qualitative discriminations, and eventually in dealing with what Taylor is going to call the moral sources themselves, or the constitutive good, we're dealing with articulation, what I would call articulation-dependent goods, or articulation-conditional goods is maybe better, right? These are goods, the perception of which is conditional on their articulation. It's, I think this becomes really easy for us to think about if we transpose it into the field of relationships. You maybe you don't, but I find that now maybe a little bit less so because I've lived with my family, my wife and my children for so long. But when we were first dating, I spent a lot of time talking about that relationship with other people, with my brother, with my close friends, with Karen herself, right? Like I had to talk through it in order to discover what it was that we were finding in each other, in order to discover what that relationship was. It's not that that relationship just existed. I mean, I was attracted to her when I first met her. It was great. We were in the rainforest in Belize. It was a really wonderful event. But it's like if it had just stuck there, that would have been a great adventure, right? But it was through the process of articulating and thinking about it, thinking about what I was feeling, thinking about what I was conflicted about, thinking about what she was feeling. All of that brought the relationship into a richer and richer focus, but not just revealing something that was already there. It built something that couldn't have been there otherwise. You can't just talk your way into a relationship like that, I think. It seems like there's a certain something that needs to be there, but it's conditional on you doing the work in order to bring that relationship to its full flourishing. And Taylor's saying there's something about the moral life that's like that. It's conditional on engaging in those kind of conversations, that kind of reflective work where you start to say, well, what is it like? What am I feeling? Why do I feel conflicted when I walk on the streets in San Francisco nowadays? And how do I respond to that, right? It's the work of the moral life is actually beginning to have those conversations with your friends, with your opponents, with your peers here, right? With the traditions that you were raised in, the traditions that you rebelled from, and the traditions you're attracted to, right? It's all about just bringing further and further reflective articulation to the process and allowing the goods to then emerge on the top of that articulation. They're not entirely constituted by that articulation. Taylor is pretty sure they're real, but they're conditional on that articulation for their emergence. Another reason why it's important for us to articulate, and this is a key to the chapter, is because when we're brought into relationship to those goods, those deeper goods, it's not just that we have a sort of new aesthetic appreciation for the possibilities of life, right? So if you're a sommelier and you learn to taste and to discriminate between really subtle variants in certain wines, that's wonderful. It probably adds to your pleasure, but maybe also makes it harder to enjoy certain cheap wines that I afford. But it has it's an aesthetic pleasure. Moral sources, though, when you're brought into contact with them, Taylor says they have an empowering aspect. To be drawn into a relationship to deeper and richer moral sources is to make yourself available to the empowerment that they provide. Now, that can be quite negative if these moral sources are leveraged for oppressive possibilities. And that's one reason why Taylor is going to say, let's really think about what articulation involves. But the human life apart from this empowering relationship to moral sources tends to stall, tends to fall beneath itself. Motivation leaves. It's what it becomes actually the medievals who often you all know that when I'm not doing this kind of stuff, I think about the medievals a lot. The medievals had a lovely word for it. They talk about acedia. You might, nowadays it gets translated as sloth, which is a terrible word. It makes it just sound like you're sort of sluggish. But acedia is much deeper than that. Acedia is, it's sorrow over non-attachment to the good, right? Acedia is a kind of sorrow over not being attached to the good, and that's why it leads you to this sort of sluggishness, or what we think of as sort of slothfulness, hard to get up and move. Acedia is not just, say, depression. It's being out of touch with these moral sources, because the empowerment that the moral sources provide, the motivation that they provide, is absent then. Yeah, sure. Okay, so now Taylor, having thought about this empowering aspect, he says it's helpful to make one last significant categorical distinction. Let's make a distinction between life goods on the one hand and constitutive goods on the other. Life goods just are what an older tradition would have called the virtues. Life goods are things that it's good to be, right? So life goods are something beyond what modern moral philosophy is capable of asking about, right? The sort of what it's good to do and the commonalities that run through all the various things that it's good to do. That's the task of a lot of modern moral philosophy, at least right up until Taylor's day. Life goods go beyond that. Life goods are about what it's good to be. This is where the whole realm of virtue comes in. But then Taylor says there's something that causes these virtues, these life goods, to be good. There's something that, because these life goods are in relationship to it, that's what charges them with their goodness. And this he calls the constitutive good. And the key about the constitutive good is it's not just what it's good to be, or it's not just what it's good to do, it's not just what it's good to be. The constitutive good allows us to then ask the questions about what it's good to love. The constitutive good is loved in and for itself, not because it brings you to some place, not because it contributes to a life of flourishing necessarily, not because it adds to success, not even because it makes you a better person. The constitutive good just is good. And so it can be the object of love. By love, Taylor, I think he means what you're moved by, what inspires you. As Taylor writes elsewhere in an essay reflecting on Iris Murdoch, who's so important for him, he says, beyond the question of what we ought to do, we need to move beyond the question of what we ought to do to that, to what it is good to be, and then beyond that again to what can command our fullest love, right? So, and the problem with the constitutive goods is, if you're listening to me, you might think, well, okay, so he's describing God, right? Isn't that what's going on? He's now reached the point in his philosophy where he's sticking God in, and it's accurate to say that this is where thinking about God would be if you think about God. But Taylor very much wants to say that the role of a constitutive good is not exhausted by theistic systems. You don't have to be a theist to have constitutive goods in your life. In fact, he wants to make a sort of BA argument, right? A BA principle argument, best account principle argument, to say that everybody has a relationship to some sort of constitutive goods in their moral life. He thinks we have to have this, we have to make some sort of implicit appeal to something like this in the course of living the sort of lives that we as human beings live. I think one way to talk about it would be to say that the constitutive good is structurally transcendent to other goods, but it's not necessarily metaphysically transcendent. Does that make sense? Right? So it has a relationship to other goods, to the hierarchy of goods, or to the value, to the discriminated world, universe of goods that Taylor's been describing throughout this book. And the constitutive good has a sort of empowering relationship to them. It's transcendent, but not metaphysically transcendent. It doesn't mean it's beyond the earth. It doesn't mean it's beyond the natural, right? It just means that in relationship to these other goods, we're talking about another level, right? A different, it's not on, to use Deleuze's language, it's not on a plane of immanence with the other goods. Or to use Heidegger's language, Heidegger talks about the ontotheological constitution of metaphysics. The constitutive good is constitutive of our ethics. Taylor's talking about the good as constitutive of our ethics. You can't get away from thinking it. When Heidegger talks about ontotheology, for those of you who this means anything to, this will be interesting. For those of you who don't, I'll try to make it as simple as possible. By ontotheology, Heidegger means that our relationship, our making sense of things, always appeals to something like God, but it doesn't have to be God. It's just the thing that guarantees that our words, our meaning, our logos, and being coincide, right? Why is it that you think whenever something weird happens, there's an explanation, right? If there's a crack outside and a flash in the sky, we don't all just assume like, well, crazy things happen, right? We think there's a reason for that. Why did that happen? I want to know why that happened. What's going on there? That idea that there's a reason why things happen is bound up, Heidegger says, with the idea that there's that being and rationality somehow coincide, that there are causes for things that we can discern. But why would we think there are causes for things in the world? Why not just think crazy things happen? Well, it's hard to get through life that way. You'd probably not get very far if you didn't go searching for causes and so didn't discriminate about how the world organizes itself. But Heidegger thinks we've got no good reason for that. That's just ontotheology. It's like we've placed a thing that functions like God at the top of our explanatory mechanism that holds together reason and being. Taylor's saying, Taylor's constitutive good is a bit like that. It's the thing that holds together all of the sort of moral sources, all of the moral discriminations that you make in your life. It's going to get a little more complicated in a second, but it could be anything, right? Or not anything, but it doesn't have to be transcendent, right? So Taylor takes the example of Kant. He says, for Augustine or Plato, it's transcendent, right? For Augustine, it's God. For Plato, it's the good epikeina theousios, the good beyond being, right? It's the transcendent. But for Kant, the constitutive good is the human self. It's the transcendental self, which is not transcendent. It's just the structure of your mind, right? So if you think about Rick's, it fits very well into Rick's circles with the sacred or the what do you describe that as?
Well, it's multivalent, but it's the locus of consciousness, of agency, of spirit and soul, purpose and meaning.
Okay, so that Taylor does the same move though that Rick does with it in saying that has now been shrunk into the Kantian self. So that's the constitutive good. All right.
When you say, can I just ask one quick? When you say structurally transcendent but not metaphysically transcendent, would there be a difference between saying structurally transcendent and phenomenologically transcendent? As long as you didn't mean by phenomenologically transcendent, metaphysically transcendent.
Right. Yeah, I think that you could speak.
Because experientially, it's transcendent.
Yeah.
That's what makes it constitutive.
Yeah.
But one is not claiming, therefore, that it's coming from heaven or from the Platonic archetypal realm.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah, I think that would work. I hadn't formulated it that way in my head, so I was hesitant. But yeah, it's the constitutive good necessarily has a phenomenological experience to it because it's something that can be loved. It attracts our love, our devotion, our intention, right? And so for Kant, that's respect for the human self. For Plato, it's the good beyond being. Now, one important aspect Taylor says about our difference from so many of those who preceded us is that we have real difficulty nowadays in speaking about these moral sources or constitutive goods, right? They're sources because they act as this lure or this attractor or this motor, this engine, this fire of the other goods in our lives. And we have difficulty now in speaking about them in our contemporary society, especially in public discourse or in academic discourse. They were spoken about all the time in the past, right? People talked about God or the good all the time. But we still may do that in certain circumstances, but we find it difficult to do in a really rich and nuanced way in public. Taylor thinks that in part this is because a fundamental shift has happened for us, so that our relationship to these constitutive goods has changed, which has made us more demure about speaking about them. One way to describe that shift is disenchantment. Taylor reaches for the language of disenchantment to talk about it. That's something fundamental shifted in our relationship to our experience of the good and its, let's say, its publicity, its publicly available nature. For us, the good has become so, these moral sources have become so tied to what we think of as the sort of private life, right, rather than the public life, that it becomes very hard for us to speak about them. And that's one reason, he thinks, why we might be motivated to be silent about them. Because in speaking about them, we draw these conflicts out into the open that otherwise are somewhat suppressed. Right? One of the reasons for suppressing certain kinds of speech, either legally or, in this case, really through a kind of pressure, one of the reasons for suppressing that kind of speech is because it tends to give rise to conflicts that we don't know how to deal with. But Taylor thinks it's worth the risk to talk about them. He says at one point on page 96, and this is an incredible statement, he says, we need to speak about these goods that empower us, because without any articulation at all, we need to be able to articulate them, because without any articulation at all, we would lose all contact with the good, however conceived. And then, in just a single sentence, he says, we would cease to be human, which is a very powerful thought. Taylor's making the argument that the structure of human life, the distinctiveness of human life, is bound up with this kind of a relationship to the good. It doesn't mean that animals don't necessarily have a similar relationship to the good, or it wouldn't be similar, but a different relationship to the good that also structures them. But for us, we would fall beneath the kind of creatures we are if we cease to have a relationship to a moral source that can help us to order. Now, that's his argument for why we should articulate. Then he considers a few reasons for why we should be reticent to articulate. And he gives moral and spiritual reasons for reticence about articulating and bringing ourselves into deeper and deeper relations to these constitutive goods. He calls this the silence of modern philosophy, and says it's not just that we've been bewitched by proceduralism. It's not just that we've been bewitched by a certain Cartesian preference for method over the search for truth. There are also moral and spiritual reasons that drive our hesitancy here. I think the most important one, and this picks up on some of what Melissa Orley's talking about in her feminist rejoinder to Taylor. I think the most important one is what he calls the neo-Nietzschean critique. And the neo-Nietzschean critique tries to show that when we make appeals to what we take to be morally neutral, when we make appeals to what we take to be publicly recognizable goods, right? So when we do this sort of procedural thing where we say this good is required because this good is uncontroversial, or when we try to say you need to behave this way, and we just take it as given that everyone should agree on it. The Nietzschean approach to this, which is sometimes called ideology critique, tries to go and show, well, what's going on in all those normative claims? You're actually appealing to a controversial good somewhere. There's a good you're appealing to deeper in that. Taylor and the Neo-Nietzscheans are interested in doing the same sort of thing, bringing out into light the things that have been suppressed within our moral systems. But the Neo-Nietzschean critique does something different. It then goes and says all of our moral judgments are reducible to non-moral judgments. The non-moral judgment of the will to power, right? Or, if you're Foucault, the non-moral judgment of accident and historical contingency, right? So everything that you take to be given, I can tell a genealogical story about if I'm Foucault, or at least the middle Foucault. I can tell a genealogical story about it that shows that it was just rooted in contingency and happenstance, and that the reason for believing that to be good or the right way to live or something like that doesn't actually have purchase on us outside of that system, right? Does that make sense? So what Taylor's trying to say is that Neo-Nietzschean critique has a moral and spiritual source behind it. What drives that? Why would anyone buy into that? Well, if you're Nietzsche, one reason to buy into it is because you have the sense that these alternative regimes of value suppress other vital ways of being in the world, right? They suppress other living ways that you could be, suppress your bodily instincts, suppress different sorts of moral endeavors that you could engage in. Or if you're Foucault, or some sort of post-Foucauldian form of analysis, if you're Melissa Orley and the feminist groups that she's describing, you say these regimes end up oppressing people who are left out of them, right? And this is true. This is a very, very true insight. So many of our moral, not just so many, probably all of our moral frameworks have been used to oppress and exclude those who don't fit into those moral frameworks. So there's a spiritual and moral motivation to be careful with them. Melissa Orley, if you got to her chapter on Taylor and feminism, it's on Canvas if you haven't seen it yet. Melissa Orley makes the argument that she's even a little bit worried about Taylor in this regard. She thinks that Taylor's good sometimes is too identified with the way a given good could be realized in society, and that makes her skittish. That makes her think that could prop up regimes of exclusion without in any way wanting to say that Taylor's trying to do that. She thinks Taylor's a great guy who's trying to do his best, but sometimes his vision of the good, she thinks it should be a little bit more apophatic. He should be a little bit more hesitant about naming the good as beyond our communities or beyond our societies than he does. We could talk about that later if you want, and what we think, to what extent Orley's right there. And this Neo-Nietzschean perspective, think about it as an emancipatory genealogical perspective, right? The emancipatory drive to produce genealogies of our understanding of the good that show that they're historically contingent and not transcendent has real force to it. But Taylor wants to make a rejoinder to this and say, well, that's true. I hear that, and that's a good caution. But if you look at the Neo-Nietzscheans, aren't they also in the lure of a moral source? Aren't they also in relationship to some sort of constitutive good, right? The good of the vital flourishing, or the good of emancipation, the good of the undoing of ideologies, right? And so Taylor's point, coming back to that, is that's true. I hear that, and that's really important. We need to sit with these kind of critiques. But if our best account still requires us if our best account of how we can't but live in the world still identifies, still articulates something that has this structural relation to a moral source, isn't it better for us to name that? Isn't it better for us to be honest about that? Not just isn't it better to be honest about it, but also by naming it, there's a kind of therapy that happens. And this for two reasons. One, because we've seen throughout the previous 4 chapters that the way in which moral progress is made is by bringing to articulation and conversation and confrontation what was previously implicit. It's something like the depth psychological move, that bringing what was merely unconscious into consciousness allows a greater, a new sort of relationship to constellate over it, one that brings further consciousness, further reflexivity to it. So Taylor's saying we shut down moral growth if we don't talk about them. Secondly, these sources do empower us. So if we find ourselves stultified, or if we find ourselves confronted by moral challenges that seem intractable, one historical way of getting beyond that is to bring ourselves into a deeper relationship with the good that can revitalize a culture, that can produce a renaissance or a renewal in the moral and spiritual lives. It might not be that it might not happen through the dominant forms of the culture. Oftentimes it happens through forms of the culture that are completely unknown, right? There's that lovely W.H. Auden bit where Auden is reflecting on the fall of the Roman Empire, and he says the great, I can't remember the exact line, but the gist of the sentiment is the real horror of the fall of the Roman Empire is not that it collapsed, but that for 400 years things just kept going on as normal, right? That there's just this sort of move into decadence and a kind of falling apart, but everything just went on as normal. But of course, that's not exactly the case. There was also something that Taylor's going to make going to spend a fair amount of time thinking about. There was a colonized people out in Palestine, in Judea, where something completely different was happening that would morally transform what was previously the Roman Empire, right? That was a new moral source that was brought into history at that time, and that changed the way of thinking about things. So we might find ourselves out of touch with, we might find ourselves, like Taylor's bewitched philosophers, having a difficult time articulating what our moral sources are and even bringing them into relationship with each other. In fact, Taylor says we necessarily do. We're conflicted because we have all of these different strands of moral history in us, so we have a variety of conflicting moral sources. Not just one. Each of us is built of conflict that way, that we don't know whether it's reconcilable. But there could be some place. It could be some place in the global south, or it could be children sitting in front of their schools on Fridays where a different kind of moral source is emerging that we don't fully recognize, but that they're being brought into a greater proximity to the good that can call forth new relations, new differentiations, value discriminations among the various goods through which we order our lives. All right, I'm going to stop there. There's, if maybe afterwards, if we want to, during question and answer time or something like that, we could go into Taylor's. He presents a kind of quaternion structure for thinking about our relationship to the goods and things like that. But I think that's a good spot to maybe hand it over to Rick.
Sure. So, wonderful job, as always, Jake. He's so, you're so good at what you do. I was going to order my speaking here during the break after I knew what we covered here, but I will.
Oh, I didn't even put you on the spot.
No. Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you repressed yourself for more, like we're all growing through your articulations, so that's cool.
Would you prefer the time in the break?
Well, no, I mean, why don't I why don't I just touch on a couple points before the break and on a few
Sounds
things after, and we also can do some of our discussion before the break too. Let's just see how it goes. One thing I was going to say about, when he speaks of Neo-Nietzschean, when Taylor does, you can see that he makes a distinction between the Neo-Nietzscheans and Nietzsche, a very important one. And one of the sources of some of the Neo-Nietzscheans is the Gay Science, written before Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And in that book, there's certain passages that lay out in the most kind of forceful and eloquent terms just how absolutely disordered, chaotic the universe is, and that we are. That's the source for many current critiques by some philosophers and thinkers of the postmodern era into thinking that we are just imposing our order arbitrarily on the chaos to serve the will to power. I mean, that they are regimes of truth, as Foucault might say, imposed on the chaos. So that's one part of Nietzsche. Then Nietzsche comes up with Thus Spoke Zarathustra erupts in his consciousness in the years after that, and having gone from this place where he had pretty much driven the critique of every one of our moral values that we thought were of a high, noble quality, and recognized that really what's underneath it is something much more base. He's really got, he's got the disenchanted universe behind him. He's got Darwinian instinctual explanations for things. He's right anticipating so much of Freud and psychoanalysis and what really is going on when we say, I'm so worried about you, I love you so much, is really the person has got just the opposite unconscious destructive intention, or that the act of giving something is actually an act of aggression. All those classic psychoanalytic tropes, of course, are anticipated by Nietzsche. And he had pretty much driven that skeptical seeing through to the furthest point when of a kind of nihilism, when this sort of eruption happens in January of 1883, and he feels basically emerging in him this great, that beyond that nihilistic crisis is a complete affirmation of all that is, complete yea-saying, as Nietzsche put it, as Taylor described it there, and that's the hypergood. That he actually he embraces a very high, highly valued good that he loves. Mm-hmm. It fills him with inspiration. I mean, that's why Zarathustra is probably the most rhapsodic philosophical text we'd ever read, because it is filled with him having had a contact with a moral source that just inspires him to great heights. Sometimes Taylor uses Neo-Nietzschean. There's a couple points where he, I think, is a little loose in how he uses it, and you can't say that all Neo-Nietzscheans, for example, when he's talking about one of the dangers of this suppression of the discussion of moral sources and of the good, is that that is part of contemporary moral philosophy, is that you you obscure the fact, the extent to which our moral philosophy is very human-centric and subjectivistic, and that claims for the moral claims on behalf of other forms of life other than the human are not brought up for debate in this kind of exclusively humanist, subjectivist discussion. And he not only links the naturalist, reductionist to this problem, but the neo-Nietzscheans. But part of one form of the neo-Nietzschean is ecological. I mean, deep ecology, and he even brings up the ecological claims at a certain point. He brings it up briefly in terms of one form of utilitarianism that Peter Singer represents, giving, I don't know if we consider Singer, he's certainly not a conventional utilitarian, but Singer really is putting so much stress on the importance of our moral obligations beyond just the human. But I really think there are ways in which we need to make distinctions amongst the different neo-Nietzscheans, and Taylor's generally very, very good about that. Since you brought up Melissa Orley, I'll just say a couple words about.
Yeah, good. I want to talk more about it.
You will too.
No, I want us all to talk more about it. Yeah.
I agree with her project. Agree very much with her project to use Taylor's sources of the self to enhance feminist discourse and its aspirations. I think I mean, you can see how much she's been inspired by Taylor throughout that essay. And I sought to do that myself, to apply Taylor's work in this book to clarifying and forwarding feminist thought in my own thinking and in discussions with others. Now, she basically is contrasting the sources of the self Taylor with some of Taylor's other work in the politics of recognition in particular. And I think in some ways she's saying, hey, you're not always remembering what you did in Sources of the Self when you're applying it over here with the politics of recognition. But every once in a while she says there is some warrant in Sources of the Self for questioning. When she says what Jake brought up about is the good not, she wants a more apophatic view of the good, that it's not getting too specified. But I see that is Taylor's position, is that the good is never fully grasped and is continually, our intuitions of the good are very fluid and continually evolving. To me, that's one of the basic underlying themes of Sources of the Self. And it's because of his understanding of supersessions of the hypergoods, which he understands in terms of transitions. You remember how he talks about how we understand shifts in our lives and of our moral values because we've gone through a transition by which we feel that we've got a perspective on what we were doing as being, in some sense, less full, less rich, less deep, less worthy than the position I'm now seeing my life from. And that sense of a transition is the basis upon which a whole culture can make that kind of shift. And to me, that his understanding of supersession and transitions powers his sense of an authentic moral evolution of the good. I think she sometimes feels that maybe Taylor's good is too Platonic, as a kind of reified static thing that's tied also to a particular cultures. I don't see that in him. To me, the whole book. But I'm much more focused on Source of the Self than I am on his political philosophy. So, but she's trying to bring them in dialogue. She also talks about incomparable for a social group. That his use of the word incomparable points to, she feels that this makes it, that it's reifying it too much. And to me, it doesn't mean that it's, just because it's incomparable for a person or for a social group, doesn't make it absolutely valid. It's just that it's descriptive of our experience of it, the phenomenology of that group's sense of the good. And that's why he specifically uses that word towards the end of chapter 4, called the word interpolate. I-N-T-E-R-P-E-L-L-A-T-E, interpolate. It's a fantastic word, and in some ways, it's at the core of what he's doing in the book and in chapter 4 in particular. Interpolate is a word that the P-E-L-L part of the root means to drive, and to get, like, interpolate would be to interrupt what you're doing or how you're seeing something, to drive you to a new position, and it, so that the recognition of the claims of a good or of a hypergood, it, when he says they interpolate us, they move us and inspire us, but they also interpolate, meaning they kind of awaken us and disrupt how we were in order to reconfigure how we're acting, and in some sense, the force of it, it's got force, and the force of that recognition coming from the moral source is such that our new identity is constituted by that force. That's what the word, I think it was Louis Althusser, who a Marxist, who started using interpolate that way, how something can constitute our identity and Taylor's using it in that way. You think about how a near-death experience might reconfigure our moral values, that it interpolates us, and think of when that the man named Newton, not Isaac Newton, but the Newton who composed Amazing Grace, and he'd been John Newton. He'd been a slave captain, a slave ship captain, and he, at a certain crucial point, awakened to what he was doing, and had this experience of divine grace that just made him utterly look at his actions in a completely different way. That's why there's that line in there saying, who could save a wretch like me? I once heard a group at Esalen, when I used to live there, and they're singing Amazing Grace out in the lawn, but they changed the word that would save a wretch like me to some more New Age uplift kind of thing. I thought, no, that's not the. You're completely missing the whole interpolation, the whole kind of shock to the system of. And it's Paul getting knocked off the horse, or Saul getting knocked off the horse, and realize, God, I've just been persecuting, and I just see it in a totally different way. So, to me, Taylor, that's why Taylor discusses how hypergoods when we have that experience of an emerging hypergood, as we all are now, for example, about our ecological practices, totally different than the moral values that were just pretty close to universal a generation or two ago. How much it's shifted in the culture in the last 50 to 70 years in terms of patriarchy. Just huge moral shift has been happening. And this is happening in the culture. And so I think Taylor really does accommodate transitions and supersessions. And if I understood Orley, I think she may have been underestimating what he does do in Sources of the Self. But I think I so applaud what her basic intention is throughout that, and she really captures his language very well, and in applying it to like that feminism is going to have a much stronger constructive force to the extent that it does articulate what it is good to be, and not just what are the wrong things to do, and what are the laws we need to shift, and so forth. We need to have and in a way, this has also been called upon in the environmental world, like not to get stuck in just a kind of puritanical naysaying of like, this is the wrong thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do, this is wrong. So that pretty much it can have a paralyzing effect on people, but rather articulate a vision of the good. I think this is what, people like, Thomas Berry and Brian Swimme with their vision of the ecozoic. That's the idea of the ecozoic serves as, remember how Taylor talks about how there's these terms, 4 terms that are in loose packages that he wants to focus on. The terms are of how the self, the nature of the self, the nature of our goods, a certain conception of what a society is, namely what it is to be not just a self or a personal agent on one's own, but in a community of other personal agents. So you have a vision of society, and in the 4th one, it's a narrative. It's a vision of like history. So he says these 4 terms kind of unfold in in loose packages, and that's what we'll be seeing unfolding here. Well, when and the vision of history is, in fact, a kind of moral source. That's why people who have a feeling that they are serving why Christians who feel they're or Jews who feel they're serving the divine plan of God in history, and they're in touch with that. That motivates them. It's a moral source for them. Others in the modern era had the sense that they were serving progress, that they were going to bring betterment of humankind's condition. And if you read, I think it may be in Taylor's Source of the Self later on, Condorcet's beautiful passage that he writes about while he's in prison in the French Revolution, talking about a vision that even as he may be dying, the ideal of what's going to carry humanity forward to greater and greater freedom and knowledge and breaking free from these chains. This is a moral source for him. So is the ecozoic. The ecozoic ideal is a moral source for those who embrace it. It's a vision that that inspires and compels and interpolates. Maybe I'll just say one last thing, and then maybe we'll take our break, and then maybe I'll say a few other things afterwards. I wanted to say about the four-term, the packages that he talked about at the end of chapter 4, and you could think of them as archetypal gestalts or worldviews. It's a vision of the human and the human agent or self. It's a vision of the society. It's a vision of history. And it's a vision of the good, of our moral visions. And what I think we naturally all want to add to those four terms, being in PCC, is there's a cosmology that's tied to every one of these packages. There's a vision of the cosmos. What is the nature of the cosmos? And so those different circles, for example, that I've drawn of the different worldviews, those are different relationships, both of the individual to the good, but also and to the society, including that hyper-individualism of the modern society, where the individual is in the anonymous urban environment that's like a kind of meaningless void, and that only in the privacy of your own subjective life is there deep meaning while you're going through the bleak, objectifying city, compared with the life of living embedded in a community, in a tribe, in a small town, and so forth. So in all these ways that those diagrams of the different worldviews convey a vision of our relationship to the society, to our vision of the good, our vision of the divine, which is very I'll bracket that because that overlaps so much with our vision of the good. Things, what you can see when Taylor's describing the big modern move towards the human, where the rational agent of Kant soars above the rest of creation. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's just introjected the divine quality, but within the immanent. And then, but then what I'm trying to also add is that there's a cosmological dimension to every one of these: the disenchantment of the modern, the participation mystique of the primal, the differentiated cosmology of the axial age with its transcendent divine locus of ultimate value compared to this world, the empirical world, the Plato's cave, the world that we're living through on our way to heaven or hell, etc. But that the human has that special relationship to the divine transcendent. Each of these is carrying a cosmology that I think we'll be able to see interwoven through all the narrative that we're going to be looking at here. Okay, so I think we'll just stop right there. Come back after 20 minutes. I'll say a few more words of things I actually prepared for to say. Try to nail it down to the more specific, important ones, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Rick, you left something from last week, ontology of the moral framework.
Yes, I can get to that too. Yeah.